Hey there, philosophical friend. It is Christopher here from thephilosophical.life.com. And I am excited to bring to you this video on the free will hypothesis. According to this hypothesis, people are morally responsible for what they do because it's ultimately up to them how they choose, act, and shape their character. This implies that people's choices and actions are not determined by things over which the people have no control. You're going to also learn in this video two challenges to this assumption, one from divine foreknowledge and the other from causal determinism. So stick around to the end to get those. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. If this is your first time here, I want to welcome you to this channel. Feel free to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to not miss any future videos. And also, I want to share with you a free PDF that I put together that will really give you some value with regard to learning about free will. It's called the 16-Day Free Will Challenge. It helps you go from no knowledge of free will to really understanding free will in no time. So go ahead and download that free guide at thephilosophical.life.com/free will challenge. Now, the big idea for today is, as you can see on the screen, that our practice of holding one another morally responsible, when we do that, when we say you're morally responsible for something, well, that has an assumption built into it, namely that we're justified in holding people morally responsible for what they do because, in part, their actions weren't determined by factors over which they had no control. For instance, if somebody was if we held somebody morally responsible for, say, dinging our car door because they opened their car door into ours, or their car door went into ours, that assumes, for instance, that their car door didn't slam into ours because of a super strong gust of wind. This actually happened to me, and we were parked at a place, super strong gust of wind. The door got away from me and just slammed into the car next to me. Now, I may be legally responsible, of course, for that, but I was not morally responsible because it wasn't an intentional act. The gust of wind was a factor outside my control that caused that door to create the damage in the other person's car. So that assumption is built in, but as we're going to see, that assumption has problematic consequences and implications. Now, the free will hypothesis is a hypothesis posited to sort of make sense of the way that we handle these situations, like when we judge that people are morally responsible and why, versus holding that non-human animals are not morally responsible for what they do and why. So the free will hypothesis separates those cases and gives us purchase on explaining why we hold people morally responsible. Now, to see how this works, let's contrast two cases. The first case is Tupac Shakur's death. So Tupac had, as you can see on the screen there, he attended a Mike Tyson boxing match. And this was on September 7th, 1996. So he basically watches Tyson in spectacular fashion KO this boxer Sheldon in Las Vegas. Tupac leaves the fight, goes to a casino, gets in an altercation with a Crip gang member. They have like a little brawl. It's a scuffle. I guess Tupac pinned him down, or somehow the gang member ended up on the ground. So I'm sure he was frustrated with that. It was broken up quickly due to security. So then Tupac goes back to Suge Knight's little apartment that he had, and they're getting ready. They get ready. Now Tupac's going to go do a little concert at a club in Las Vegas. So Suge Knight gets in the car, starts driving him over to the club where he's going to perform, and a car pulls up next to him, fires a bunch of shots into the car where Tupac is and Suge Knight. Suge Knight tries to speed away. Tupac gets critically injured and later dies. And Suge Knight, although I guess he got some scrapes, he ultimately survived with his life. Now, this is actually the car that was being driven and shot at when Tupac died. So his death, Tupac's death, was a horrible moral wrong. Like somebody pulled up and pulled the trigger. There's a lot of question about who did it and why they did it, but whoever did it, somebody did it. Somebody pulled the trigger and shot him. They committed a horrible moral wrong against him. They're morally blameworthy and deserve to be punished for their horrific act against Tupac, namely his murder. Now let's contrast Tupac's death with another celebrity death. So this, you may know Steve Irwin, the Crocodile Hunter, as he's known on TV as a personality. He'd always do like weird shenanigans with animals, specifically alligators, wrestle them, show he was doing it for educational purposes, but he often courted danger and got really close to the animals, really interacting with them. You can see him there, like holding down a alligator. And what wound up happening to Irwin is he was shooting. This is the actual one of the last images of Irwin alive. So he was actually shooting on location for, I guess it was his daughters, either his daughter or his sons. They were actually starting to do a TV program themselves. And so he wanted to be part of it and kind of help them out. And it's kind of a neat thing, like a parent being able to sort of partake in what their kids are interested in, and it aligns with their interests. And he got too close to this stingray, and the stingray shot out its barb and pierced several times, actually, and pierced his lungs and ultimately pierced his heart. And his death, though, although it was horrible, it was ultimately a tragedy. Why? Because that stingray didn't commit a moral wrong against Steve Irwin. In a sense, that stingray was acting out its, out of its instinct, probably mistaked Steve Irwin. There's some theories about it, but the shadow might have thrown off the stingray and he thought it was a predator, and so lashed out to try to, kill it or take care of it. So it wasn't like the stingray had intentions and, intentionally committed a horrific act. It was sort of just a tragedy. And what explains this difference? Well, this is the free will hypothesis. The free will hypothesis explains why the stingray killing Steve Irwin is not morally responsible for doing so, whereas Tupac's murderer is morally responsible for killing him. Why? Well, as it says there, this hypothesis holds that people are morally responsible for what they do because it's ultimately up to them how they choose, act, and shape their character. Now, if we freeze frame the two examples of someone getting killed right before, the instant before, or just a few seconds before the act was committed, before the trigger was pulled on Tupac or the stingray attacked the Crocodile Hunter, if we freeze frame those cases and look inside the psychology or the makeup of the two entities, namely the human that pulled the trigger and the stingray, then we'll see that the human had an arrangement of dispositions and desires and actions. And it could have even been something like rage or revenge or wanting to get back at Tupac or whatever it was. But they had some strong inclination and beliefs that were inclining them to commit that horrific act. But there's a sense in which they could have done otherwise. Namely, the shooter could have decided to put down the weapon. They could have decided to, just shout something and not actually kill him. Whereas if you look at the stingray, if you freeze frame it right before the instant before it kills Steve Irwin, there's a sense in which the stingray could not have done otherwise. Namely, the stingray was acting out of instinct. It was almost a snap reaction that the stingray couldn't have done other than attack or try to neutralize what it perceived to be a threat. It couldn't sit and reason and say, well, maybe I should do something different or marshal up reasons, if stingrays even have reasons, to do something other than kill Steve Irwin. So the free will hypothesis explains that The murderer is morally responsible because it was ultimately up to him or her whether or not to kill Tupac. Whereas, on the other hand, it wasn't ultimately up to the stingray to decide whether to kill Steve Irwin or not. It was sort of more up to biology and instinct at that point. Now, you might wonder where this leads naturally. Well, let's look at this detailing of where this leads as put forward by Gideon Rosen et al. In their textbook, The Norton Introduction to Philosophy, second edition. This is the presumption of freedom. What is that? Well, it's laying bare what we're assuming when it comes to the free will hypothesis and where that leads. So you might have noticed I use that phrase, could have done otherwise. Now, it is a huge debate in the free will debate whether or not free will requires the ability to do otherwise, but there are many people who think it does. So this is picking up on that, and it goes as follows. Number one, a person is morally responsible for an action only if she performs it freely. Number two, a person acts freely only if she could have done otherwise. So there's that could have done otherwise phrase. And then number three, a person could have done otherwise only if her choice was not determined by prior factors over which she had no control. Now the presumption of freedom continues. So 1 to 3 entail number 4. What is 4? Well, it says that a person is morally responsible for an action only if her choice was not determined by prior factors over which she had no control. So you may recall from the start of the video, that was the implication that comes out of the free will hypothesis. We assume the free will hypothesis says people are ultimately responsible for what they do, and that's why they're morally responsible, because they ultimately decide and determine how they act, how they choose, and how they shape their character. And then an entailment from that, we're more carefully laying it out now, but an entailment of that, really from 1 to 3, is that basically when people decide to do things, they aren't sort of forced to do that thing by factors over which they had no control. Like the stingray had no control over its biology, where presumably the killer had control over his or her intention to murder. But we think, and this is number 5, we think people are kind of typically morally responsible for what they do, given they don't have abnormal psychology, and we're not in a case of coercion or manipulation of their brain and so on. We typically think like if somebody intentionally harms another person, then they're at fault. They're morally responsible for harming that person. Now, if people aren't morally responsible for what they do, then they're not blameworthy for what they do. And you could say, well, just a tragic event happened. Like when that person, like let's just go back to the Tupac case, when that person pulled the trigger and shot Tupac, if people aren't morally responsible for what they do, then the murderer is not blameworthy for killing Tupac. And it's becomes more like a case of the stingray killing Steve Irwin. It's sort of a tragic event. It's just tragic and no one's really at fault. But wait, don't we want to say like, no, people are morally responsible and blameworthy for what they do and they're at fault for doing it. And that person that shot Tupac deserves blame and punishment for what they did. So when we put together 4 and 5, we derive 6. Namely, we derive the fact that typical human choices are not determined by factors over which the agent had no control. Why? Well, people are morally responsible for what they do, and a person is morally responsible for an action, for doing something, only if her choice was not determined by prior factors over which she had no control. So from those two, we can derive that typical human choices are not determined by factors over which the agent had no control. So this is where it gets interesting. How justifiable is number 6? That's going to be the key question. Before we discuss those two historically important challenges, let's get in on the table to get you in sort of the right mind space, how you might start doubting the veracity of free will. So you might say, people often say, I just know I act freely because my first person experience is as of having all these paths before me. That's why I included this picture where you sort of, you're the causal train of actions going one direction, and then you get to a fork in the road. You could decide to go right. You could decide to go left, right? You could decide, like, for instance, Tupac's murderer could decide to kill him or not. And there's this sense in which that's what's required for, that's how it feels to act, and that's what's required for freedom. These alternate possibilities, these different ways that things could have played out. And there's nothing forcing you might feel, to go one way or the other. Like, I just know I have free will because that's how it feels. It feels like there's nothing forcing me to do one thing or the other. It's ultimately up to me which direction I go. But not so fast. Why not so fast? Well, what you're relying on to make that call is the experience, the conscious experience as of making decisions. And you're saying, it feels like I act freely, like I had all these choices laid out before me and I just choose the one that I most desired to choose, but I easily could have chosen otherwise. Well, actually, relying on conscious experience as sort of, and the fact that it felt free when you made a choice doesn't necessarily justify the fact that you are free. Why? Well, we know from human psychology and from physics and so on that often the causes of action are not at the conscious level. They're in some sense hidden. And for instance, people have implicit biases. At the conscious level, they may say, for instance, I am not a racist. I do not hold racist beliefs. And yet they act without even perhaps connecting the dots in a way that betrays racist action and wording and behavior. So given that, they might say consciously, I'm not a racist, but yet implicitly they may hold biases against stereotypes and biases against certain minority groups. And that's what's causing them to act the way they're acting. But their first person conscious experience doesn't give them access to those implicit biasing factors. So what this means is that our choices might still be determined by factors that we are unaware of. And for instance, you see a flash of lightning and you don't see what causes it. You just see the effect, but that doesn't mean that nothing caused it. Well, similarly, an opponent of number 6 will say, just because you don't see the factors that were controlling you and forcing you to go a particular way, doesn't mean that those factors weren't there forcing you to go that way. You were just unaware of them. And introspection, or sort of just reflecting on your first person conscious experience, can do nothing to exclude that possibility. So reflecting on how it feels to act can't exclude the possibility that you're not determined to act the way you act. You may think you act freely and you reflect how it feels to make a choice, and it feels like you could go all these directions, but that in and of itself can't exclude the possibility that you were in fact couldn't have done otherwise, and there were factors outside your control determining that you go only one way. So these doubts about free will kind of grease the wheels for the next two, the big ones historically. The first one is divine foreknowledge. So basically, God's infallible knowledge of the future undermines number 6. How does this work? Well, a traditional conception of God is all-knowing. And not only all-knowing, but God is often what's called a perfect being. So a perfect being knows all truths. There's no error within that being. So God infallibly knows all truths. God couldn't have gotten it wrong about the future. So, for instance, going back to the Tupac case, God knew Tupac would get shot. Now, let's freeze the frame. Could Tupac's murderer have actually falsified God's prediction of what he'd do? Well, no, because God formed the belief that the murderer would kill Tupac in the past. Namely, God is in time and foreknew that the murderer would shoot Tupac. Now, given that, the murderer can't change the past, and the murderer can't falsify God's belief and make it the case that the murderer doesn't shoot Tupac. Why? Because God's beliefs are infallible. Namely, God's knowledge, ultimately, God's knowledge is infallible. God couldn't have gone wrong about what he knows about the future. So Tupac's murderer's choice to kill him was determined by God's prediction. That is, the murderer couldn't have done otherwise than align with what God predicted in the past the murderer would do on that date in 1996. Thus, because the murderer's choice was determined and freedom requires the ability to do otherwise, the murderer wasn't able to do otherwise, had to kill Tupac, and therefore his choice to kill Tupac wasn't free. It was determined by factors over which the agent had no control, namely what God believed and knew in the past, and the fact that that happened in the past, and you can't change the past. The past is over and done with. So that is the first big challenge to number 6. And the second big challenge, which we're going to really discuss in detail as we go through this series on free will and moral responsibility, is causal determinism. So very briefly put, causal determinism is about cause and effect. And it's basically that there are chains of cause and effect that go all the way back as far as possible. And if you take any snapshot of the past, like if you had a total description of the physical universe at a particular time in the past, you could take that plus the laws of nature that govern how everything in the physical universe interacts, and you could apply those laws. And then basically what would wind up happening is you'd have only one unique future. There's only one way things could go into the future, given the past and the laws of nature. Now, why is this a threat to number 6? Well, again, the fact that something that happened in the past ultimately causally determined you to do something in the future means that you're not free. You're not able to change the past and what led to what you're about to do. And the universe plays out in all ways, and basically it has to happen though exactly as it does. There's only one option given the state of the universe and the laws of nature, causally speaking, going forward. So if causal determinism is true, and you can't change the laws of nature, you can't change the past, then you are causally determined to do what you're about to do. So again, Tupac's murderer, given the remote past, a time in the remote past, describing the full state of the physical universe, plus the laws of nature, when it came time for Tupac's murderer to pull the trigger, he or she couldn't have done otherwise. So that means people don't act freely on this conception, because everything that occurs in the universe is determined to happen exactly as it does. I hope you found this video helpful. In the next video, we're going to go a little bit deeper and play this out into what's called the dilemma of determinism. But until then, I commend you to download that free PDF that will give you a path basically to study free will and go deeper. And in no time, just sort of, I did all the hard work for you. I did all the heavy lifting. You just have a path laid out to learn about free will, and all the resources in that path are all freely available on the internet. So I encourage you to get that at thephilosophical-life.com/free will challenge. And until next time, keep learning philosophy and thinking critically about life's big questions. That is, keep living the examined life.